Hi everyone, my name is Lauren and these are my colleagues Amy and Paul, whom you'll hear from shortly. The case study we will be presenting is called I Am Not Racist, taken from Hogg and Merler's book Tales from the Principal's Office, Case Studies in School Administration. The tale begins at Harmony Elementary School, 1 week prior to the start of a new school year. One of the teachers calls to inform the principal that he will be on sick leave for an indeterminate amount of time. Janice Wright, the principal, is the one who took the call and notified Human Resources immediately. HR gave the job to the most qualified teacher with the most seniority, Ms. Gillespie. Now, Janice only met Ms. Gillespie on the first day of school. She finds that Ms. Gillespie looks unhappy and doesn't smile readily even to her students, although she does speak positively towards them. The only complaint made about Ms. Gillespie was in the first week of school from Joe Ray, an Aboriginal student support worker who worked part-time with 3 Aboriginal students in the class. He complained that Ms. Gillespie seems uncomfortable with him and doesn't seem to want to help the Aboriginal students. Janice says she'll give her time to settle in. So a week later, Joe Ray rushes into Janice's office, furious, and he says to Janice, "That teacher is racist and she has to go." He explains that while he was trying to help the 3 students with their math, 2 were fooling around and not listening to him. So none of them finished their work. Ms. Gillespie accused him of being too nice and helping too much, and that's why the students weren't listening to him, and she gave them all the work to do for homework. So once Joe saw his students off at the end of the day, he walks back into the classroom to Ms. Gillespie, who says to him, "You know, they won't grow up to be lazy Indians if we make them behave and help them to develop a work ethic." Joe stops and asks her what right she has to talk to him about those students in that way. Ms. Gillespie replies, "I have Indian heritage and was raised in poverty. I know that hard work will make those boys successful. We have to make them accountable and not put up with their nonsense." And that's when Joe leaves to go find Janice. I know you're all familiar now with Langlois' decision-making matrix. I just wanted to get a quick overview before we dive into greater depth. The first step in this process is to respond to the problem at hand. So Janice is going to acknowledge Joe's complaint and assure him that it will be addressed. She's consciously deciding to take the problem into her own hands instead of sweeping it under the rug. That's why we think that Janice would schedule a meeting with Ms. Gillespie to hear her side of the story. We also found that there's value in Janice trying to meet with the students in a very discreet and non-obvious way to find out how they find school, how they find Ms. Gillespie, and how they find Joe, because they could offer a valuable insight into whether or not the program that's set up to help them succeed is actually helping them succeed. That's why we thought it would be interesting for Janice to meet with the Aboriginal Education Advisory Committee, because since Ms. Gillespie is part Indigenous and is raising concern about the program that's set up for the students, it would be really interesting to see what their take would be on the situation.
It was essential when examining the case to consider what laws were relevant to the problem that we were dealing with. We had to look at some of the principles, rules, regulations, along with procedures at a provincial and regional level. At a provincial level, we looked at the Ministry of Education's rules and procedures and regulations, along with the Ontario College of Teachers, Ontario Human Rights Commission, the Ontario First Nation, Métis, and Inuit Education Policy Framework, and employees' rights legislation. At a regional level, we looked at FMMI presence in our schools, which was essentially a guide for staff for equity and inclusive education policy and procedure. Within the Ministry of Education, there's a legal framework that is in the process of being adjusted. There are some changes being made to break down barriers for marginalized students and provide all students with equal opportunities to succeed. The ministry takes this very seriously, and through ending grade 9 streaming, proposing the elimination of discretionary suspensions, increasing sanctions for teachers who behave in a racist nature, and also through providing teachers with additional anti-racism and anti-discrimination training through PD opportunities, it is evident that the ministry's legal policy and procedures do not have a lot of room for misinterpretation. The curriculum documents and the nature of the curriculum documents, although they aren't legal documents, they're essentially provide a framework for procedures in learning, teaching and learning for students. And the goals essentially are to make for students to make personal connections and to advance their understanding and respect for Indigenous cultures. Another goal of the curriculum is to allow students to think critically and creatively about issues of concern to Indigenous people as they develop a deeper understanding of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit studies. Reciprocal relationships and the building of reciprocal relationships to support the reconciliation that's been so important between Indigenous people and Canadian society. It's also a goal of the curriculum, and also for students to develop essential skills, strategies, and habits that support culturally competent interdisciplinary learning. The Ontario College of Teachers is another regulatory body that we consulted when examining this case and making decisions. Amendments have been made to the Ontario College of Teachers Act to ensure there's transparency and accountability, and measures are put in place to rapidly respond to incidents and allegations of racism within the teaching profession. Through the ethical standards of the college, through the standards of practice, teachers are guided and are required to behave in a certain manner. There is a zero tolerance for racism and inequity in schools. The Ontario Human Rights Commission is another provincial body that was consulted in this case. Specifically, we examined the Ontario Human Rights Code and looked at racial profiling as insidious, and the fact that racial discrimination is damaging and violates people's rights under the Ontario Human Rights Code. This is not exclusive to, but it is often directed at First Nation, Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples. So under the Human Rights Code of Ontario, there's a zero tolerance, and racial profiling violates these people's rights.
In 2007, the Ontario Ministry of Education put forth a framework for First Nation, Métis, Inuit students in the education environment that intended to provide the strategic policy context within which the Ministry of Education, school boards, and schools work together to improve the academic achievement of Aboriginal students. Some of these supports put in place include Aboriginal counselors and liaison workers, extracurricular activities, and educational opportunities directly related to the history and culture of Aboriginal students. As directly related to this case, Joe Ray would be considered one of those support workers in place to help the Aboriginal students be most successful in their academic endeavors. 2009, sources reported that these counselors and support workers put in place had an overall beneficial outlook on the Aboriginal students, as well as having a positive effect in contributing to making students feel more comfortable. Another thing that the superintendent should be looking at when considering final decision and the situation would be employee rights. These documents include things such as the Employment Standards Act, Education Act, as well as the School Board Teacher Collective Agreement. Taking a more regional approach, we looked at the Lakehead School Board in Thunder Bay, Ontario. Lakehead School Board has one of the largest FNMI student populations in Ontario. One of the documents they've put forth for their staff is the FNMI Presence in Our Schools, a guide for staff. This is a great resource for both new and old staff looking to provide the best opportunities for Aboriginal students to be successful in their classrooms. One of the lines that come right out of the beginning of this is using the term Indian outside of its legal context is generally considered offensive. This is important when looking at this scenario is because the term Indian is used by Ms. Gillespie when referring to the students, and it should be recognized that this term generally is considered offensive and should not be used in the educational environment. The Ministry of Education puts forth opportunity for all school boards to put in place policy and procedures related to different aspects of their educational environment. One of these that are put forth is the Equity Inclusive Education Policy. You'll see in this slide here some of the points that come out of this policy directly related to this case.
So to recap quickly, Janice responded to the situation by acknowledging Joe's complaint, determining to deal with the problem, and meets with the persons involved. Next, she combs through the numerous rules and policies that Paul and Amy have just walked us through. That brings us to the ethical component in the decision-making process, where Janice needs to become aware of several things that are important for her analysis and conclusion of how to act in the situation. Ethical awareness involves stepping back and letting the dilemma really sink in. Janice will need to reflect on how she feels about the situation and really become aware of her own personal and professional values. These may conflict with where the legal and administrative policies seem to stand. She needs to take this into account as she ponders what action to take next, and she could call a trusted friend to get another perspective as well. Ethically analyzing the case means putting everything that has happened since the very beginning out on the table. Janice will review what actions she has taken so far, then will need to make a moral judgment and decision that she can soundly justify. It's at this stage that Langlois says the decision maker's perspective, that comes from his or her personal and professional values, is actually just as important as the legal and administrative perspective and is even considered the cornerstone of the action they choose to take. This stood out to our group as we were discussing this case, because we found it difficult to see how a principal, or even a superintendent, could possibly make a decision leaning on their own moral and professional values if those values were not strongly in line with the current social and political ones, which we're using from our society as the context for this scenario. Langlois opens her article by pointing out that rules, regulations, laws, and policies have made decision-making a democratic process with little room for the discretion and moral judgment of the leader. This is what we found to be true with this case, and I'll get more into it as we look at the case through two different ethical lenses: utilitarianism and Kant's theory on respect for persons. You can think of utilitarianism as making the masses happy. Morality is defined as making the world as happy as possible. Decisions should be made based on the balance of happiness over unhappiness that they bring. And punishment is therefore seen as evil. So if it has to happen, it should be to prevent future unhappiness, and good should still come of it, like rehabilitation for inmates in prisons. If Janice applies the utilitarianism theory, she needs to assess whose happiness is at stake. Obviously, Joe is angry, but he represents our social and political climate right now that is one of zero tolerance for action or speech that is deemed racist. So it's not just Joe's happiness that's at stake. It's also the Indigenous students, if they hear about it, as well as their parents. And then there's the other teachers and all the parents of the other kids who won't want a racist teacher influencing their children. The entire community would probably hear about this if it hit social media, and they would also be very unhappy. This would then reflect badly on the image of the school, causing the superintendent and the school board to be unhappy as well, and maybe even the College of Teachers who have one of their own saying something that's unacceptable. Janice's moral judgment and decision through a utilitarian lens would be that what Ms. Gillespie said was indeed racist, discriminatory, and unacceptable, and the decision would be to remove her from her current position, either by firing her or moving her to another school, as we've seen happen to some teachers. This analysis and decision is in line with the values upheld by the policies and laws that were previously discussed. This is a punishment for Ms. Gillespie, but is seen as one that will prevent the unhappiness of all the other groups mentioned. Also, if Ms. Gillespie does not lose her license and gets moved to another school, then part of that punishment would involve professional development that includes anti-racist and anti-discriminatory training, and learning about the policies and supports in place that are designed to help Indigenous students. This is to bring good from punishment that is seen as an evil thing under utilitarianism. Now let's look at Kant's theory on respect for persons. Kant believed that a person should never be dealt with merely as a means to an end. No matter how good our goals or ends might be, it is wrong to manipulate or use someone to reach them. When we treat a person as an end rather than a mean, we treat them with dignity and respect, and as Kant puts it, as a rational human being who is responsible for their own behavior. Treating them this way leads to promoting their welfare, respecting their rights, and avoiding bringing them harm. Punishment under Kant's theory is where the punishment is proportionate to the crime. In order to be able to treat Ms. Gillespie with dignity and respect, Janice needs to start by reflecting on how she feels about what Joe said. She can do this before even meeting with Ms. Gillespie, which occurred in the response step of Langlois' framework. I say this because of our human tendency to become angry when we hear of an injustice or wrong someone has committed. Anger is a really great and necessary emotion for flagging something wrong or bad that was done or said. But it also triggers a subconscious thought process that involves devaluing the person we're angry at. We saw this happen with Joe, who was very angry when he went to see Janice. Instead of saying something like, "Janice, Ms. Gillespie just said something to me that was very racist and inappropriate, and I think you need to know about it." Instead, his exact words were, "That teacher is racist and she has to go." He labeled her in his mind, and now he saw her as less of a teacher and less of a human being because of how racist she is. There's no room in his statement to hear Ms. Gillespie's side of the story or to try to understand why she feels so strongly about how the students are being helped. Next, Janice needs to become aware of potential ends that she might be viewing Ms. Gillespie as a means to getting to. The most important one in this case, I think, would be her desire to preserve the public image and reputation of the school by promoting the values that she and the school uphold of being against racism and discrimination. In our society, the spread of stories of racism happens like wildfire through the media and social media. It quickly becomes everybody's business. We as a society are also quick to devalue and dehumanize the culprit out of anger in the name of social equality and justice. The repercussions of not getting rid of Ms. Gillespie, as Janice would have done in the utilitarian approach, could be very severe in a zero-tolerance society. My colleagues both work in the educational sector and said there's basically no way Ms. Gillespie would get to keep her position. She'd either be fired or move to a different school. I'm a nurse and I have no idea how the school system works, so the thought of firing Ms. Gillespie had actually never even crossed my mind when I was reading the case study. My reaction was, of course, to wince at Ms. Gillespie's terrible choice of words, but I could tell that she was coming from a place of pain and of concern and good intentions on behalf of the Indigenous students. Reading the rest of what Ms. Gillespie said made me want to sit down with her, put aside her horrendous choice of words for a minute, and get to the heart of what she was trying to communicate. I think my ignorant nurse reaction is pretty in line with Kant's theory. Janice would need to sit down with Ms. Gillespie without being angry at her and without having already resolved to get rid of her, and really create a space for Ms. Gillespie to share her perspective, where she is treated with dignity and respect, where her opinions are heard and acknowledged. Under Kant's theory, Janice would have to choose to treat Ms. Gillespie as an end, which I think would mean asking the very hard questions that Ms. Gillespie is getting at. Is our program really setting the Indigenous students up for success? Are we equipping them with the competencies they need to succeed in life when they no longer have Joe hovering over them? Or are we enabling them to become undisciplined and unmotivated? Both Ms. Gillespie and Joe have the same good intention to help the Indigenous students, but they are on completely different pages for how this should happen. Janice could hold a meeting with Joe and all the staff, maybe even as well with the Aboriginal Education Advisory Committee, and bring forward the concerns raised by Ms. Gillespie and see how all of them can brainstorm on how best we can support these students, whether it's to stick with what we're already doing or to consider changing some things. Punishment under Kant's theory should be proportionate to the crime. Now the big question is, proportionate in whose eyes? Because our society, laws, and policies view punishment to racism and discrimination as a basis for removing Ms. Gillespie from her position of influence over children. Under Kant's theory, Janice may view a proportionate punishment as apologizing to Joe, the other staff, maybe the Aboriginal Advisory Committee as well, and having to take anti-racism and anti-discriminatory trainings, as well as be brought up to speed on what is being done at this time to support the students and how she can participate and contribute rather than complain. Let's take a look at the strengths of Kant's theory here. Through it, each person is seen as valuable, worthy of dignity and respect. Dignity is maintained and protected here, even if the person has done something worthy of punishment. A person's right to speak and explain themselves is upheld, and they are given the space to be heard. The weaknesses of Kant's theory are that it doesn't take into account how other groups of people impacted by the situation feel. The punishment may also be seen as too merciful, and there is a lot of room for subjectivity when it comes to who decides what a proportionate punishment is. Utilitarianism's strengths are that it acknowledges the impact a decision or law has on everyone. It gives groups of people a voice. The goal is also to bring more happiness than unhappiness to the world, and that good should come even out of punishment. The weaknesses are that the voice of the masses can overpower those of individuals, and therefore happiness of the many outweighs happiness of the few. And punishment is dependent on the dominant social and cultural values that the situation occurs in, which can be seen as a strength if you agree with the punishment, or as a weakness if you don't.
Now that the superintendent and or principal have had the opportunity to meet with all parties involved, check their thinking with the policies and procedures in place, and analyze their own ethical thinking and outlook on the situation. It's time for them to receive and look for validation and support for their final decision. This support is dependent on the country, province, or district that you teach in based off the political hierarchy of that specific area. In this case, we'd be looking for validation and support from the superintendent and the school district commissioner. The final decision ultimately is the responsibility of the superintendent, whether it is their outright decision or one that is voted to be the best decision with the school district commissioner. It is important for the superintendent to remain fully transparent throughout this process to avoid future grievances. One of the final steps of the decision-making process is that meeting between all parties involved, including the superintendent and the party that may be receiving repercussions, in this case, Ms. Gillespie. It is important during this meeting that the superintendent preserve dignity and maintain a climate of respect for the other parties. In order to ensure this is the case, the meeting will be recorded. For example, in the case, if it's decided that the best plan of action is mandated professional development in regards to FNMI students in the classroom for Ms. Gillespie, the superintendent may wish to have other parties involved, including the principal, as the principal will be beneficial in mandating as well as ensuring accountability for the professional development taking place. Now that all the steps of the decision process have almost completed, it's time for the conclusion, in which a report is drafted with all the main elements of that final meeting, as well as the steps taken to get to that final decision. The meeting may not provide closure for all parties involved. For example, in this case, Ms. Gillespie may feel required to file grievances or complaints. We feel in this case it would most likely happen, as Ms. Gillespie's comments regarding her heritage and life experiences, she may feel that she was treated wrongly if a stronger repercussion was the final decision.
Assessing consequences and effects. Due to the incident, the administrator and Lakehead District School Board will have a deepened awareness of the issue of discrimination against Indigenous students. In turn, this will allow both groups to quickly identify verbal and non-verbal acts of discrimination towards this group of students within the school and within the broader school board. The Lakehead District School Board and the administrator will implement professional development opportunities for teachers with a goal to support Indigenous education strategies and to provide equity for all students. The administrator, working in conjunction with the board and the Indigenous Education Advisory Council, will draw on resources like guest speakers to help share and celebrate Indigenous culture within the school. Proactive outreach strategies targeting parents will be implemented to communicate positive initiatives taken regarding Indigenous students and equity in the school community. Some final thoughts. Through a thorough assessment and extensive discussions regarding the case, I Am Not Racist, our group was able to agree on many items and drew the following common themes that include the importance of adhering to the law and ethical values in society in regards to systemic discrimination in the field of education. Both the Kant and utilitarian theoretical perspectives worked well in assessing our case, and either could be applied as we worked through the Langlos's ethical decision-making framework. The application of utilitarianism theory was optimal, as we felt, due to the fact we valued implementing law and regulations determined by provincial and regional officials. Utilitarianism allowed for the outcome to consider the impact on all internal and external stakeholders involved, therefore having a positive impact and creating a best case solution for everyone. PD for teachers within the school and board-wide was definitely an important element in improving the cultural climate around Indigenous students and proactively moving forward together. Thank you.